Hello, my friends. I'm Deepak Chopra. We're back again having a conversation with the eminent philosopher, scientist, genius, luminary savant, uh, Ervin Laszlo, who's written numerous books, and we have had previous discussions on the nature of fundamental reality. So, Ervin, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit why this new paradigm that you and I are exploring from what we could easily call monistic physicalism to monistic non-duality or monistic consciousness only paradigm. Why is this important? What relevance does it have to the future of well-being as a human species, future of well-being on life on our planet, and the future of evolution in general? Why is it important?
Because it shows, it argues, it tells us that we are connected. It's more than connected, more than externally connected. We are intrinsically connected in a way that what is happening to one of us happens to the others too. We are as in a hologram where all the information is in all the parts. So it's important to know that what we do is not external to what we see. What we see and what we do are parts of us, and we are part of it. So I think this is a very important thing, because if we feel you are really connected and are part of something, you are not going to disregard it. You are not going to disfavor it. You're not going to sacrifice it because it feels like part of you. So I think the way to love, the way to cooperation, the way to understanding is to expand your consciousness so that you begin to feel that I and you and the others around us are not separate uh, little entities, little thumbnails running around on space and time, that we are really a part of a tremendous cosmos and universe that is interconnected and that is whole. It's the old idea of holism coming again. And it's very important today, because I can talk about it later if you like, but I think most of our problems are due to the fact that we think of ourselves, me and mine, and the people around me, of course, my enterprise and so on, as being unique and separate. And it's not separate if it's connected. So it's very important.
So, I notice you frequently talk about the holographic paradigm or the holographic model of understanding reality. And so, a long time ago, when I was still struggling with the idea of inseparability, or you might say interconnectedness, or even it's more than interconnectedness, it's non-local correlation or inseparability or entanglement or whatever you want to call it. But a long time ago, this is 30 years ago or more, I was privy to an illustration. I think it came from David Bohm's work, where there's a fish in a tank. Let's pretend this is a fish, and you are looking at it through different perceptual windows. So from one perceptual window, you see only this. From one other perceptual window, you see only this. But every time this moves too. Every time any part moves, all the different perceptual windows, if there were, let's say, an infinite perceptual windows, you would see all of them correlated, and you would think they're all separate. But actually, if you had access to the whole vision, you'd see it's one thing. And it's a movement. It's a hollow movement, and we actually take a snapshot of the hollow movement every time we perceive something. Perceive means see, taste, touch, smell, whatever. We take a snapshot and then we give it a name: Higgs boson, Milky Way galaxy, or whatever, a hand, a pen, or a book. But actually, it's all one being. It's the infinite. I kind of, do you relate to that? Am I saying it
I
incorrectly?
think That's a good way of putting it. I think it's as close as we can get by language. Language separates anyway. You say this, or that, and then it looks like it's not the other thing because you identify it as this.
So, in my own personal spiritual exploration,
Mhm.
for decades, I've asked myself, why do humans have this language that we call narrative language? I mean, to some extent every living species has a language, right? Birds communicate through mating calls and so on. Any biological species has to communicate at least within its own ecosystem, but also with the larger ecosystem. And so in a way there's primitive language throughout nature. Now, when I go look up the evolution of language, I don't find any literature that actually is convincing. Why did language evolve? Why did narrative language evolve? Why did mathematical language evolve? Why did musical language evolve? Is language a clue to reality, or is it an obstruction to reality? The fact that language evolved means it has to have function. And without that, we wouldn't have the physical universe that you and I have, because it's a model created by language. Everything that we call scientific models, but also our technologies, everything from this Zoom call to airplanes to rockets to ships to automobiles to the internet. It's all an offshoot of our ability to symbolically represent human experience. So I believe that language, despite its limitations, is actually a clue to how we construct reality. Um, I'd like your input on that.
But we are misconstructing reality in the ordinary subject predicate language. We say this is a red stone, you know. The stone is the subject, red is a predicate of it, This is a soft cloth or whatever. And we identify things as separate, as individual things. And underlying this field of interconnection, there are no individualities, no particularities. It's all sort of joined together. But to be able to survive, we have to do something, do violence to this. We have to say, we'll behave, we'll talk as if things were separate. There's a survival imperative. Now, there are some cultures, I'm told the Hopi Indians, for example, are not talking in subject predicate terms. They're talking about verbs. You don't say this is a tree. This is something that's treeing. It's something that's acting as if it was a tree, but it's fluid. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. So language could be much better than what it is and what we are doing. But an ordinary everyday language is misleading. You have to reconstruct it and then put it back into place again. Because when we are reconstructing, then we don't have separate things. And I can't see you, I can't identify you, I can't identify the picture on the wall behind you, and nothing is separate, you see. So I have to do this violence to the reality, which we are beginning to be convinced that is the deeper reality, that it's all a flow, it's all an interconnected field, an information energy field. So, but this field is extremely, extremely rich, and everything is in it. You mentioned that example with the pen. Very beautiful, good. We can understand that how one thing is connected to the other. You look at one and change it, and the other one changes as well. There was also a very nice example made by Carl Pribram, the neuro brain researcher who did fantastic work with chimpanzees and so on. He said a very simple question to overcome this separate uniqueness. And take a projector, any normal projector that has a lens on it, and enter a slide or enter a picture, a film or whatever into it, take off the lens. Then you have all the lights, all the frequencies that make up the picture. are jointly coming out of that projector. Now put it in front of a screen, and you don't see anything. You see the optical array, as it's called. You know, it's all the colors, all the shapes are all in it together, so you don't see anything. Now take that lens and put it in front of the screen at any point you like, and lo and behold, the whole image is appearing on the screen behind it. You can take several lenses, and you have several images. So you don't have things that are separate, and that's something that we can easily do. We can try it ourselves. All the information is all over, and that's what we can say about the universe. All the information is given in all its parts. We are not a drop in the ocean. We are the ocean in a drop. As it were. Rumi, I think, says something like that. I think language, we have to overcome this everyday language, and yet maintain enough of it so we can survive. We have to eat, we have to reproduce, we have to find shelter. I mean, the world around us has to be comprehensible, but it's a very big price we are paying for comprehensibility of the world when we say that we believe that the world consists of separate entities, each with its own particular characteristics. That's a very big price because it distorts reality.
So, current science as we know it is based, as you know, on reductionism. Anytime you mention holism, a lot of current contemporary scientists would call that pseudoscience. They would say uh, real science, quote unquote, is just what we observe as out there, reductionistically separate entity. This is a rock, this is a tree, this is a Higgs boson, this is an electron, this is whatever, a gluon particle. That's current science. And anytime you bring in holism, people do object. Now, last week I interviewed Frank Wilczek, 10 Keys to Reality. He's a Nobel laureate in physics and current contemporary Nobel laureate in physics. And he's a brilliant, obviously, scientist as a Nobel laureate. And he's also a deep reflective thinker. And so somewhere in this book, he says that the most fundamental entities in nature, and now he's talking science, physics, the most fundamental entities in nature, in the universe, are what he calls spin, charge, and mass. Spin, charge, and mass. Then, furthermore, in this book, and I don't have time to find the page, he says that these entities, spin, charge, and mass, do not have any physical structure. They are structureless, number one. They don't have a shape or a volume. They are just entities where spin, charge, and mass reside. And spin, charge, and mass are the alchemy of the universe. Now, I asked him, then can you call spin, charge, and mass matter? And he said, well, matter is much more mysterious than we think it is. But, by our ordinary definition of matter, which would be a noun, a tree, not treeing, I think mass, charge, and spin are actually the fundamental processes in the Indian Vedic tradition. They're called gunas, or qualities of awareness that differentiate into the appearance of the physical matter. But the gunas are basically the creative process, the process that transforms, and ultimately that which appears as a physical form. So the sattva is creative process, rajas is transformation, and tamas is what appears as matter, which seems very similar to actually spin, charge, and mass as inertia. So those are actually the three qualities of consciousness that are projecting as the universe, including that which we call our own body.
I would accept that. Its characterization of that is the fundamental reality, fundamental entities. I'm not happy with the term entities, though, in this regard.
Okay,
I
so
think
what
they're
would you call?
characteristics.
Huh? Sorry?
They are characteristics. They
I
are
like that. Qualities, qualities.
by which we measure things that appear that we can grasp something different from other. Where is the difference? This is not it the same as that it, because otherwise they would be both its, the same. This is this and that's that. So we can tell different values of spin, charge, etc., to en masse, to the micro level, to the bottom level. But one thing that he doesn't seem to take into account is what would actually lead us to holism, namely that when entity or characteristics, I like to talk about clusters of vibration, peak frequency vibrations in a field. When these things cluster together and join in a higher level, and there's a level of integration, they are in the same phase, for example, they are joined in the same phase, and they are something that we can distinguish as together, then we notice that together they have different characteristics than separately.
I like that. I like the characteristics is also suggests qualities of awareness, which we call qualia in current
Yeah,
consciousness literature. So maybe they are qualia. That's all they are. And the shuffling of qualia creates the differentiated universe of separate objects.
that's why it may be like that. But certainly what the universe is not like, it's easier to say than what it is like. What it is not like is a bits of pieces of separate objects that are basically material. Max Planck says there is no such thing as matter in the universe. And I would subscribe to that. I said what we call matter is not a thing, an object. It's a verb. It's mattering. Certain vibrations, certain frequencies are mattering. I just invented this, so I haven't really used it yet. But they act as matter, as though what corresponds to our everyday notion of a material entity. But they are not there because they are not separate. They are an element or an aspect of a larger entity, of a larger totality.
I like that. Consciousness is mattering, or even consciousness matters as a verb.
Yes,
Consciousness matters as a verb.
as a verb, yes, yes.
Okay, so now here's another person I've been talking to. His name is Donald DeGrazia, and this is a book he published recently. It's called What is Science? He's a professor of physiology at medical school in the United States and somewhere in the Midwest. And he's also a student of Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism and Sankhya and many other Eastern wisdom traditions, but also a student of Western traditions. So in this book, he says something very interesting, and now I've kind of asked other scientists about that. So he says, as you know, Immanuel Kant said, we can see something as it appears to us, but we can never know the thing in itself. That's Immanuel Kant. And he said, we can never know the thing in itself. But of course, Immanuel Kant was not a yogi and had not practiced samadhi or the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or he knew little about or nothing about the vibhutis. But let me see what Don DeGrazia says, and other people agree that when I look at this, all I see is a reflection of certain wavelengths. Everything else is excluded. So, what I'm seeing when I look at this is basically a partial force field that we call photons, electromagnetic frequencies. The rest of what this is as matter is not reflected, and the bulk of it is the thing in itself. And so every time I look at it, all I see is a superficial reflection of a force field. And what is seeing is also a force field, okay, electromagnetic activity. But when I touch this, it's the same thing. Electrons bump into electrons, and I feel the resistance, and I call it a sensation called touch or sensation. But that's true of all the five senses. When you taste or smell or see or touch or hear, you are actually not perceiving the object or the thing in itself. You're perceiving a fragment of your own perception. But what you're perceiving is just a reflection of what is. The thing in itself is actually infinite. So this is the infinite appearing as this, just as the infinite appearing as this appearing the infinite as this, because what I perceive through my five senses is actually what I don't even touch. Even when I walk on the ground, I'm actually at a very, very subtle level floating. My force field, electromagnetic force field, is interacting with the electromagnetic force field that I call the earth.
It's a nuclear reaction if you're actually touching it.
Correct. So we never see reality, we never touch reality, and yet we call it reality. If we were to know it, and that's where samadhi and yoga comes in. When I do dharana, which is focused concentration or attention, dhyan, meditation, the flow, samadhi, when I become one with this, then this is me and I am this and I am all this at the same time, which is what we say in the Eastern wisdom traditions. I am the universe, aham brahmasmi tattvamasi. You are that, I am that, all this is that, that's all there is. And if you ask, what is that? It's the infinite being. And infinite is not a monstrosity big entity or large entity or small entity. The infinite is formless, without boundaries, and therefore unimaginable. And you see that concentration of your characteristics, which leads to the whole universe, is the basis of everything, including atomic power. We say energy everywhere, that's omnipotence. Information everywhere, that's omniscience. And then presence everywhere is omnipresence and omniscience. We are describing terms that have been used for ages. Nothing new about this, just a new language.
I'm happy to go a long way along with this, but I don't see the need to bring in infinity per se. There is sufficient evidence now that to be able to say with good reason that the universe is not infinite, is in space or in time. There is something in which the universe was born, perhaps at the Big Bang, but that could call it the cosmos or call it the one or whatever. That could be infinite, but we are never in contact with it. We don't know it. We can't know it. What we can know is something that emerged in that cosmic base, ground. And what emerged, perhaps with the Big Bang, it's most likely, is itself finite. And it is, there I want to say, this finite, I want to call it a thing, I don't even like to call it an entity, this finite capricious, is something which is integral, which is united, which has no boundaries, no internal separations, and therefore it is, I can describe it as a field. I can describe it as a whole field, as an integral field. I use the term Akashic field to refer back to the Akasha, as the Hindu seers were calling this underlying dimension. So I think the universe is, to my mind, best comprehensible. I'm not saying is, I'm saying the universe is best comprehensible as a whole system. And what there is in the universe, in this whole system, are not separate entities, there are partial subsystems which are interconnected, but each within its own domain, within its own dimensions, is an integral, non-separable and non-separate system.
So far, I'm totally in sympathy with what you're saying, but I still think the underlying reality has to be infinite. The emergent reality is finite as we experience it, but is infinitely transforming, endlessly transforming. So that endless transformation must be an activity of the infinite,
Well, I mean, we talk about
whatever that is.
infinite and endless. It's not something that we can conceive, not
Yeah,
something that we can deal with. There is so far an open-ended series of transformations that we can say.
correct. Okay, so last as we are closing, in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says to Arjuna, um, first of all, he says, "Prakritim som vashtvai vishwajami puna puna," curving back within myself, I create again and again. But then he also says, "I am the field, and I am the knower of the field. I am the field," and the Sanskrit word for that is kshetra, Kurukshetra, the battlefield of consciousness, where all the forces of light and dark are constantly engaged, creativity and entropy. I'm the field, but I'm also the knower of the field. So, normally when people talk about electromagnetic fields and force fields, they're not talking about what you're talking about, the Akashic field, which is the field that also knows itself as the field.
Indeed, this universe has a capacity for self-knowledge, for self-reflection. How it came by, that is perhaps the great mystery of creation, but it has a characteristic whereby it brings together complexes of vibrations and charge and mass, complexes in such a way that they together seem to form an entity, but they seem to form an entity. If you look at them in detail, they are still those elements. I would add frequencies and vibrations to that, and wave dynamics. But that is as close as I think we can get. We have to survive, so we have to break that open and talk about things with characteristics. But as long as we recognize that these things have this curious characteristic, curious quality of being able intrinsically interconnected in such a way that they are in a context that in which we take it, they are one. They are not separate. And I think you find that in, very well, the Eastern tradition, I think in all the great spiritual traditions, we have this notion of an ultimate togetherness. Now it's breaking open when you are applying it, because you say, so how do I behave? So what do I do? And then you must find your way around the world as though it would consist of matter-like entities. Also,
So,
I would be matter-like, yes, is correct, but not matter.
as you know, Erwin, right now, the holy grail of science is supposed to be the unified field theory, the grand unification, where people are still struggling to unify gravity with electromagnetism, the strong and weak interactions. And some people feel that that's probably an impossible task because we're talking about two different categories of reality, gravity not being in the same category as the others. But if we go beyond the physicalist paradigm and we actually understand what you and I have been speaking about right now, then the singularity would be pure consciousness that is differentiating itself into knowers, modes of knowing, and objects known all within itself. It's just like a stem cell differentiates into a body, pure consciousness differentiates into the experiences of all sentient beings, which simultaneously are knowers, modes of knowing, and things known within themselves, species specific, But in that matrix of sentient beings, there is obviously a crossover because we do communicate with domestic animals. And in a sense, we are entangled with all of life, whether it's microbes or fungi or plants or whatever. So, given that different understanding, consciousness is one, modes of knowing and perception are innumerable. Things known are innumerable. They're not even things, they're actually modalities of awareness. They are innumerable, but reality is one. And this leads me to the final question. You know, Tagore, the great Indian poet, who had conversation with Einstein on the nature of reality. As we know, Einstein was what we might today call a naive realist because he believed that the physical world is real in the way perceived by the human senses. And Tagore was more of an idealist, but he was also steeped into Vedanta. And so they spoke at length in 1930 before the war. And that conversation is actually recorded in the New York Times. It disappeared afterwards because of the madness of the Second World War, and people weren't interested in these deep issues. But as we know, Einstein is known for saying the moon would still be there if no one was looking at it. And Tagore's query was that that's a human moon. It's not the moon of a horseshoe crab, for example. And now I'm taking over. I'm
Yeah.
editing what he said. But the moon is different to every different species. It's a perceptual activity, but at the source of it all, there's one consciousness. And so Tagore also said in one of his other beautiful poems, love is not a mere sentiment. Love is the ultimate truth at the heart of the universe. First of all, would you say that love is then the singularity?
The ultimate, it is the ultimate truth. The universe is one, and love is a characteristic of that one. It's not something that we can take apart. We can this A loves B. I think love is the attraction of this universe in such a way that elements that appear to have been separate, whether they are mass or vibration or charge, elements that seem to have been individual joined together, and together they form a higher level, more complex, but at the same time integral entity. And I think the consciousness per se is not something that's produced by these phenomena. This consciousness is as basic as energy and information, and of course far more basic than matter, which doesn't exist. So I think we have to go back and recognize that the universe is not comprehensible in the Newtonian reductionist model, not even as Einsteinian relativistic model. And we are groping how to understand it, because every time we put it into words, we break it apart. So, I mean, the great sages have been right when they said, you just have to behold it and you have to allow it to penetrate you. And because as soon as you grasp it, you're broken. But still, we have to survive, and we want to know a little bit more about this. And there are certain characteristics, as long as we call it characteristics and not absolute separate properties or aspects of characteristics, that in this universe are evolving over the space-time manifold since the Big Bang. They're evolving, and there is a sense, to me this is very, very important, there's a sense in which this phenomenon, which we call the whole system, which is the universe system, is becoming more complex, is becoming more coherent, and is becoming more integrated. And if we know this, if we allow this knowledge to penetrate to us, and we also recognize that we are participating in that process, in that evolution process, then we recognize ourselves as part of a tendency to become more whole, more integrated, more unified, more complex at the same time, and that will then hopefully try to align ourselves as much as we can with this cosmic trend instead of putting ourselves separate from it, from to the outside, because we are not outside, we are in it. If there's one thing that we can really learn from the new sciences, nothing is outside of the universe. We are in it.
I think that is a good close to our talk today. I would like to call it um, grand unification of reality, an alternative approach, conversation with Ervin Laszlo with all the credentials.
Deepak, if I may, I would like to
Yes,
also
please.
hold up one book talk about
Yeah,
in this book
please
about
do.
reconnecting to the source.
Reconnecting to the source. In fact, why don't we call this talk that? Carolyn, let's call it Reconnecting to the Source, a conversation with Ervin
That's
Laszlo.
what we have been talking about. We
Hmm?
have been talking about the source. We have been
Yeah,
trying to understand the source.
yeah. So
And
we
we
should.
are, I think, agree that it's very important that we are trying to understand it, that
Correct.
we're
So
trying to be
that's a great title for
what the
the
source
talk.
is.
Okay.
Please hold up the book again, just so we can see. We got it. Let